Such a beautiful song. Well, good morning. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So today doesn't happen a lot. This is kind of unique. St. Patrick's Day, and it falls on a Sunday. And St. Patrick, wow, what a guy. Amazing individual. But I thought it would be kind of helpful to dispel some rumors about Patrick, some of the false or fake news that have cropped up over the years. For instance, St. Patrick was not Irish. Did you know that? Did you know that St. Patrick didn't wear green? He didn't. Chances are, if he was wearing a color of Ireland, it would have been blue. St. Patrick, there is no record of St. Patrick using a three-leaf clover as a teaching device for the Trinity. He probably didn't dress like this because that hat in the picture is called a mitre, and those didn't come into popularity until the 7th century. St. Patrick probably did not drink green beer. Probably didn't drink beer at all. He didn't banish the snakes from Ireland. There's never been snakes in Ireland. Never will be snakes in Ireland, hopefully. And if you're a golfer, that's really good news. And here's the amazing thing. He's not a saint. He's never canonized as a saint. Probably no character, at least in church history, has as much fabrication and embellishment as St. Patrick. But I totally understand why. Because he was a remarkable individual. He left his mark not just upon the Irish, but upon all of us in one way or another. And I know what we do to remarkable people. We like to tell further stories about how remarkable they are. Well, I thought today that I'd spend a few moments talking just simply about Patrick and share some of his story without the embellishments and the additional fabrications. Patrick was born in the late 300s, probably around 380, on the western side of England, probably what is in today Wales. He was born into Roman nobility. His grandfather was a priest in the Catholic Church. His father was a deacon. But as a teenager, like a lot of teenagers, Patrick really wasn't interested in God or faith or the church. He was more interested in having fun. But at the age of 16, thereabouts, one evening, some marauding pirates from Ireland came into the shores of western England, and they captured Patrick along with others. The women they probably raped and left behind. The older men they probably beat or murdered, because it was the young men that they were after. The young men would be sold into slavery in Ireland, which is indeed what happened to Patrick. He was sold to a Druid tribal king or chief, and he was then forced to be a shepherd for this tribal chief's flock on the far western side of Ireland. Do you have those places in your life where you just won't go? Maybe it's like the Tenderloin district up in San Francisco. You don't want to go there at night. Or maybe it's Skid Row in LA. You don't want to go there day or night. Or maybe it's the Oval on the north side of town. Or maybe it's your teenager's bedroom. Whatever the case, for cultured Roman Empire people, of which England, Britain, was a part of, the world ended for them on the western slope of the United Kingdom Isles. And across the Irish Sea was a place nobody wanted to go, because there were pagans there, barbarians. There were stories of human sacrifice. And, well, are any of you full-blooded Irish? Do you know full-blooded Irish people? Unlike the Scandinavians, who hold their emotions close to the vest, the Irish are known for having emotional lives and letting you know exactly how they feel at the moment. And even more so, back in Patrick's day, the Irish were a fighting people, a warring people. And for Patrick to be whisked away to the far west side of the Irish Isles, his family was absolutely certain that he was dead and gone, never to be seen again. So while tending the sheep on the western slope of the Atlantic Ocean, Patrick experienced two amazing things. The first thing is that he began to learn the language of the Irish. He began to understand their culture, and he began to like the Irish. The second thing that happened was this faith that wasn't important to him as a teenager became important for him as he now spent days and nights, oftentimes by himself, exposed to the elements. We only have two things that Patrick wrote that still have survived and have told us about his life. One of those writings is called his Confessions, an autobiography. And in the Confessions, Patrick wrote this: "I would pray constantly during the daylight hours, and the love of God surrounded me more and more. Finally, after 6 years of being a shepherd, he heard a voice telling him, 'It's time to go home now. It's time to go home.' So Patrick snuck away in the middle of the night, wandering 200 miles from the west coast of Ireland to the east coast, and boarding a ship on its way to England. It was a harrowing journey, but eventually he made it. And imagine the joy and the delight of his family to see the one that was once thought to be dead, now alive. So overcome with gratitude, Patrick devoted himself to God and went to the seminary. Without a formal education behind him, remember, missing 6 years of education, but going to seminary, becoming a priest, being a pastor of a local parish, and eventually being consecrated as a bishop. But then, late one night, when Patrick was about 48 years old, which was in those days the retirement age, he hears another voice that gets his attention. And this voice had an Irish accent. It said, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." Here's where Patrick's story comes full circle. Like the story in Genesis about Joseph, sold into slavery by his brothers, and that event, God turning it into a good thing for the Israelites, Patrick's years as a slave was now going to be a blessing for the Irish, and a blessing for him. Now obviously his family was far from excited to hear that Patrick would be returning to the land of the barbarians. And truth of the matter is that the other bishops and priests equally were not supportive of Patrick. But Patrick gathered a handful of parishioners from his church, and together they set sail for the very island in which Patrick was once a slave, and now, returning, would be a slave, a runaway slave, perhaps returning with a price on his head. Church historians have pondered the question, why was Patrick so successful when there were others who went before him, some with limited success in ministry, but very few? Why was Patrick so successful? 3 things come to mind. The first thing is that he knew these people. He had lived among them. He had experienced their life. And he not only cared for them, he loved them. Seminary professor and historian George Hunter, in his book, The Celtic Way of Evangelism, says this: The fact that Patrick understood the people and their language, their issues and their ways, serves as the most strategically significant single insight that was to drive the wider expansion of Celtic Christianity, and stands as perhaps our single greatest learning from this moment. There is no shortcut to understanding people. When you understand the people, you will often know what to say and do and how. When the people know that Christians understand them, they infer that maybe the high God understands them too. I'm challenged when I read that passage, because there are certain groups of people that I yearn to know and to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. But if I wish to see them have this faith encounter, if I wish to be a part of somehow them hearing this message, it suggests that I have to get to know them. I have to understand the life in which they live, the experiences that drive them, the stories in which they live. And if I don't, then I might be a hindrance to having them hear how important a connection with Jesus Christ is. The second thing that made Patrick successful in his mission outreach was that he would start high, but he would go low. What does that mean? It means that when he and his group wandered into a territory, the first person they always sought out was the local tribal chief or king. And there were hundreds of such kings all throughout the Irish Isle. They would start with the permission giver, and they would ask the king if they could have the freedom to wander among his people to talk about God in a new light and in a new way. And in some occasions, the king or tribal chief would be receptive to hearing and believing what Patrick had to share. But on other occasions, he just simply gave them free rein to walk and to enjoy the people. And most of the times, the people that Patrick would first go to after meeting with the king are the lowest of the low people in that community. Female slaves, women who were enslaved to more powerful people. So I want you to get this picture. Patrick is going to a people that the rest of the Britons and the rest of the people in the Roman Empire say are the worst of the worst, the barbarians. And then among those people, Patrick goes to the lowest of the low in order to build his church. You see, Patrick is only following the lead of his Lord. He knows that Jesus said that he came not for the righteous, not for the healthy, but for the sinner, for the sick. He knew that Jesus was a friend to the tax collectors and to the sinners. And are any of us surprised that the good news of Jesus Christ is often heard easiest and best and believed the most among those not of social pedigree or power, but among those who live in the underside of life? You see, I think that if we wish to be a church that reaches others effectively for the gospel of Jesus Christ, we have to desperately reach out to those who are in desperation and need what Jesus has to offer. The third thing that Patrick did was to create communities. Whenever he was successful in an area to find people receptive to the gospel, he would leave behind fellow English travelers, and they would build a community. Literally, build a community. They would find an encampment, and then build a fence or a wall around that encampment. And they would invite anybody who wanted to live in that encampment, they could do so, with the promise that it would be a healthy place to live, and that the community would help one another, and that the issue of war and fighting would not take place there. No weapons allowed in the encampment. The only rule that those people had to live by was the rule of loving the neighbor. The one thing that I love about Patrick in setting up these indigenous communities is that he allowed each to create their own style of worship and their own ways of living within God's life. Of course, this really ticked off a lot of the church hierarchy back in England and even in Rome, because Patrick did not require that worship would be done in the Latin language. It was okay to be done in the Irish. He allowed women to be leaders in the church. He allowed lay people to consecrate the elements for Holy Communion. And he would baptize people, some of which hardly understood the gospel, but for Patrick, the baptism was so deeply important. And while the rest of the church was struggling all over the continent of Europe, in Ireland, it was exploding. Can't help but think about Patrick when I read Paul's letter to the Philippians. Because in actuality, Paul and his ministry become somewhat of a paradigm for Patrick. Paul, a Jew, crosses all of these social barriers to reach out to the Gentiles. And he lived and worked among them, and he cared for them, and he loved them. And it came at a cost. There were other apostles and other church leaders who wrote Paul off and said that his ministry was not valid. But Paul pressed on to give priority to the Gentiles. And even among the Gentiles, Paul seemed to go low as well. In the letter to the Philippians, he reaches out and speaks of two women whom he calls co-participants in the ministry of Jesus Christ. Women in those days. And at that time, he takes a young person, a teenager probably, by the name of Timothy, and he pours himself into Timothy's life to raise him up to be a church leader. Paul was all about starting high, but going low in the communities that he built. And then, like Patrick, Paul sought to create these healthy and helpful communities that are called churches, that are more concerned about loving others than following the rules. This past summer, Leanne and I had a chance to travel all throughout Ireland. Beautiful country and beautiful people, and such an awe-inspiring part for me to walk and to visit in the places that Patrick lived 1,500 years ago. 1,500 years ago. And the impression that he left and the power that he had was simply amazing, and I am in awe of Patrick. The date, March 17th, is not the date of Patrick's birth. We don't know when that was, but it's the date of his death. And although Patrick traveled all throughout Ireland, he ended up dying within just a couple of miles of where he first entered Ireland as a missionary on the coast, on the east side. It's a little hamlet called Seoul. And today Patrick is buried in a town not far from Seoul entitled Downpatrick. Patrick was guided in his ministry by a firm belief that the gospel of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ himself is the key for living a full and complete life. And he was willing to open up all sorts of doors, removing all barriers so that anybody and all people could experience the power of the grace that Jesus offered. He was said to inscribe a statement of belief that became known as the breastplate of St. Patrick. In lieu of a sermon outline this morning, I have included that in your bulletin insert. I'm going to invite you to pull it out at this time. You can use the statement, the breastplate of St. Patrick, as a daily devotional perhaps over the next number of days in the season of Lent. But I'm going to invite you to say those words with me now. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I rise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through a belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. May God be with you. May Christ be in you. May St. Paul challenge you, and may St. Patrick inspire you. Amen. The peace of the Lord be with you always. I invite you to rise and share the peace of Christ with those who are